Introduction. Chomsky and others have rightly made a big deal of the fact that a good number of the sentences produced by the speakers of any given language are unique, as in, they've never been spoken before in the history of that language. I'd wager that when you take into account writing, this proportion becomes even larger, just because we tend to write longer sentences. It's all about how big the possibility space is. Let's take an extreme example. What are the chances that, if you took a number of Spanish words at random, the same length as Don Quixote, you would somehow recreate the novel? Pierre Menard understood that chances are infinitesimally small unless one can discover some principle through which to generate it, something better than mere randomness. Something like Cervantes' original inspiration. Some problems are like finding a rule, and some problems are like following a rule. Some are unavoidably confronted with a space of possibility, and some can collapse this space into necessity. It's immeasurably harder to discover a novel mathematical proof than it is to check one. It's far harder to write a great novel than it is to read one, and it's far harder to compose a brilliant song than to enjoy one. In case it looks like this is always an asymmetry between production and consumption, here's something that seems to go in the opposite direction. It's far harder to decrypt something than to encrypt it. But wait, this only works if you haven't got the encryption key, which means you have to find the rule. The lesson is that asymmetric interactions, the sender and receiver in which, can play different roles. Consider the fact that it's often, though not always, harder to learn something than it is to teach it. Scott Aaronson thinks cryptography and learning are dual programs. From this perspective, trying to learn something is like trying to decrypt the world. Part 1. Semantic Symmetries. One way to look at our cognitive comfort zones is as regions of the information processing possibility space in which these asymmetries collapse, either because we're using more or less deterministic recipes that are as easy to follow as they are to check, as easy to learn as they are to teach, or because we've all got enough computational resources not to worry about them, when it's so easy to create or discover a workable rule that it makes no functional difference. Another way of understanding this is to say these are regions in which communication becomes possible, where sender and receiver achieve something resembling computational symmetry. What I mean by communication here is more than mere information transmission. When one looks at language from an information theoretic perspective, just how complex a signal it is, once more, depends on the size of the possibility space in terms which you can calculate the relevant probabilities. Let's take English. Are we looking at strings of letters and punctuation, some 30-odd possible symbols bunched into pseudo-sentiential chunks? Are we looking at series of phonemes, 44 in all, combined in various limited ways? Or are we looking at sequences of sentences, each some combination of a near 200,000 words, according to some more or less implicit set of grammatical rules? Even at this level, we're still not talking about semantics, only syntax, and the amount of Shannon information will vary with what we pick. Chomsky's famous example, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, is still grammatically well formed, and still completely meaningless. We have to see that, in one sense, language transmits an incredibly small amount of information, and in another, it transmits a potentially vast amount. For example, a sign that reads, "Beware the dog," is only 14 characters long, but it means an awful lot in certain situations. The presence of a dangerous dog in your immediate environment is a very significant and informationally rich signal to be looped through your various predictive layers. The semantic content begins to look like it's hidden in the symmetric capacities of the sender and receiver to compress and decompress the syntactic signal with so little effort they don't even notice. It's about now that I get to sneak in a little computational Kantianism. Kant would characterize these cognitive comfort zones in terms of what he calls analytic judgments, or those judgments that express the content of the concepts through which we understand the world. Verstehen. For instance, cats are mammals and mammals are animals are both analytic judgments. Taken together, they allow you to infer the seemingly banal fact that any given cat is an animal. Kant thinks that there are other synthetic judgments, such as water boils at 100 degrees centigrade at 1 atmosphere of pressure, which enable us to draw far more interesting inferences, e.g., about how we should go about making a cup of tea, and whose truth is not dependent on the content of the concepts that compose them, i.e., water, temperature, and pressure. Indeed, once we know that mercury expands when heated, and by precisely how much, we can make a nice little thermometer to check our water temperature, and thereby just how much its boiling point changes as we vary atmospheric pressure. I've cheated a bit here because it's unlikely that the unit of measure is not defined through using facts about the expansion of mercury, but I think you get the drift. It would seem that synthetic judgments are in some important sense asymmetric. If nothing else, when you send one to someone else, you can communicate information they don't already have. Whereas an analytic judgment is less like useful information and more like a test of whether someone understands the concepts needed to receive informative judgments. Seeing if someone else's understanding of where your cat sits in the hierarchy of genus and species matches yours is one way of checking whether you're talking about the same thing. E.g., you know sphinxes are a type of cat, right? And thus whether you can tell them that cats have a toxic reaction to theobromine, and so they shouldn't give them Chairman, and so they shouldn't give Chairman Meow chocolate, you know, the sweet stuff made from cocoa. There's another asymmetry here, though. It seems as if synthetic judgments are like rules that must be discovered, whereas analytic judgments are like rules that can only be followed. How does this work? Part 2: Synthetic Asymmetries. One of the great philosophical ironies is that analytic philosophy has for the most part completely misunderstood the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. The relevant debates are dominated by philosophers who think that tame definitions of purely conventional terms, such as bachelors are unmarried men, are sufficient examples of analyticity. While slightly more subtle thinkers such as Quine and Brandom use the inadequacy of these tame examples to reject analyticity altogether, advocating some sort of unrestricted semantic holism. I think Mark Wilson provided the correct response to Quine, which is that, since unrestricted semantic holism is computationally intractable in practice, there can be nothing whose meaning is globally dependent on everything else, but only more local, if revisable, regions of significance. The best thinkers in this regard are two of the great modernist logicians, Per Montenloff and Jean-Yves Girard. I'd claim that the third is William Lavater, but he's not relevant here. Martin Loff has shown in a simple and elegant way that Kant's claim that mathematics is synthetic a priori really means. Those who, since Frege, have attempted to treat maths as purely analytic, have simply failed to appreciate Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and, in their blind fidelity to classical logic, have refused to stop viewing mathematics through the lens of completeness, despite their claims to the contrary. They are so blinded by the sheer obviousness of arithmetic judgments, such as 5 plus 7 equals 12, that they cannot see but those as analytic, and on this basis, they pretend that famous open problems in number theory, such as Goldbach's conjecture, must be analytic in the same sense, even though we know of no rule that could decide the question. Here's where we return to my claim that novel mathematical proofs are immeasurably harder to discover than they are to check. This all depends on what we mean by novel. We can work out precisely how much harder it is to solve a certain mathematical problem than another if we have algorithmic procedures for solving them. However, there are further ways of breaking down problems into more complicated computational complexity classes that enable us to reason about possible situations. The most significant of these are P and NP, deterministic polynomial time and non-deterministic polynomial time. These articulate a precise difference between problems for which there are algorithmic solutions better than randomly exploring some possibility space, and problems for which there are not. As such, if one is confronting a genuinely open mathematical problem for which there is no way of enclosing the space of possible solutions in advance, then the computational difference is essentially unmeasurable. When Martin Loff does what he does, he makes clear that what the content of the concepts is that we use to pose these problems, it's the inductive definitions of the type that specify ranges of values for variables, e.g., natural numbers, rational numbers, real numbers, and the functions that specify operations on variables of the relevant types, e.g., addition, subtraction, and multiplication, division, are precisely what we need to recursively check solutions to judgments formulated using them. 5 plus 7 equals 12. Contra Kant, it might be worth admitting that if the definition of the operation of addition is all you need to compute the results of these judgments, e.g., written in lambda calculus notation, lambda sz point s on and on, reduces to lambda xy point x on and on, then this makes them analytic. The difference between solving the problem and checking the solution has collapsed. However, something like Fermat's last theorem is still a synthetic judgment because of the fact that the concepts sufficient to pose the problem are insufficient to solve it and need to be supplemented by whole new clusters of types, culminating in extravagant abstractions such as elliptic curves and modular forms. This provides a delightful way of understanding that the para-completeness of the intuitionistic logic of mathematical justification. As we keep adding new types in order to solve problems that we were able to pose with the previous ones, we open up new ranges of problems we can pose but not yet solve. The answers to our questions keep inviting us to ask new ones. By contrast, Jean-Yves Girard has been trying to explore the analytic-synthetic distinction in more general terms. In order to relate Girard's work to Martin Loeff's, it's important to briefly mention the Curry-Howard correspondence, which is a correspondence between type theory and intuitionist logic. This means that one can view propositions as types whose instances are proofs, and conditionals, if P then Q, as functions that take a proof from one type P and return a proof of another type Q. Martin Loff built his version of type theory, MLTT, using this correspondence, extending it to include quantifiers as dependent types. This has gained new significance in recent years, as it is the basis for homotopy type theory, HOT, a new approach to the foundations of mathematics that provides an alternative to set theory. It's important to understand that though all propositions are types, not all types need be propositions. Hence Martin Loff's inductive definitions of types, whose instances are things like natural numbers, rather than proofs. Girard's work can be seen as an attempt to derive types from more fundamental interactive dynamics, rather than simply defining them. This goal is common to both his transcendental syntax project and his earlier work on Luddics. However, this was first and foremost an attempt to see how propositions emerge out of the abstract structure of dialogical interaction, along with the logical operators of linear logic. Girard is interested in more than just propositional types, and it's possible to reconstruct MLTT within his Luddics framework. What's interesting about his more recent, explicitly Kantian work on transcendental syntax, in which he aims to study the conditions of the possibility of language, is that he has developed a new conception of the computational dynamics out of which types emerge, one that can, in some ways, more easily be extended beyond the mathematical cases Martin Loff is describing to the empirical and practical cases necessary to think about communication and cognition. Luddics was about finding the dynamics hidden in the syntax of proof trees, and transcendental syntax is about finding the dynamics hidden in the syntax of proof nets. How does this help us? Because Girard begins to conceive of types as bundles of tests, which are no longer restricted to processes like checking proofs. These tests can now involve interaction with the world and with one another, in addition to interaction with other language users. Types are no longer restricted to mathematical structures, but can incorporate those computational behaviors involved in interacting with the world, and can do so in ways that need neither be linear nor entirely fixed. Precisely the sort of information processing behaviors involved in the predictive processing model, with its interacting loops of upstream and downstream signals, loops that extend into the environment as sensation feeds into simulation and simulation feeds into action. The way in which these processes communicate thus begins to look like a microcosmic model of linguistic communication, and the tests required to establish and calibrate communication begin to look like analytic queries. This is not something I wish to explore in too much detail, but I do want to tie up the point. We can see the symmetric compression and decompression involved in communication is something like functionally bisimilar behaviors. The bundles of such behaviors that constitute sortal concepts, qua types, enable us to individuate empirical objects, qua instances, in ways that are sufficiently similar to talk about them, and condense aspects of behavior that we can interactively test for in such a way that we can ascribe properties, qua predicates, to them. The high bandwidth semantics riding the low bandwidth syntax comes from our ability to sync our simulations of the world sufficiently. This almost seems like a trite point. I say my cat is a sphinx, and you develop certain expectations that shape your simulation of the world, and my cat's role within it. But this is way more interesting, because it neither involves idealized representational contents that are merely exchanged, I'm looking at you, model theorists, nor a requirement that the neurological correlates of our simulations be innate and isomorphic. I'm looking at you, Fyodor. nor a structureless play of signifiers where meanings can bleed into one another, but semiotically hemorrhage in such a way that we can no longer say anything about meaning at all. I'm looking at you, Derrida. There are definite data structures here, adapted information schemas that are getting synced up through training and calibration. We've got a marriage of structure and behavior organized through symmetries, not unlike that proposed by Tia Trafford. Moreover, we can see how something like analyticity emerges out of the underlying behavioral bisimilarities. For instance, the basic interactions through which we bundle other tests, the ones that correspond to the conditions of individuation through which objects, qua behavioral invariance, get picked out and re-identified, are inherited in a manner that is expressed by analytic judgments such as cats are animals, oil is liquid, and I am a person. This provides a logical basis for the perennial distinction between properties that adhere in substances and those that are merely accidental, a distinction discovered by Aristotle, reworked by Kant, forgotten by Fregeans, and given back to us by Martin-Löf in the form of type definitions, essence, typing judgments, individuation, and the subtle complexities of subtyping, genus, species. There's a deeper story I could tell here about logical and computational dualities, but I've got to stop somewhere. I'll leave you with a last thought. If this hierarchy of relations through which information schemas, data structures, and interactive behaviors, methods are inherited looks a bit like object-oriented programming to you, there's a reason for that. The irony involved in me describing experience in object-oriented terms is not lost on me.